We're in James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Starting in verse 5. If you get to Hebrews, keep going. James is right after that. We'll keep this. James chapter 1. But if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men graciously without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without any doubt. For one who doubts is like the surf driven on and tossed by the wind. For let not a man expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Pick up here in James. Now, last week we talked about the infamous passage that you always hear, usually misquoted. Well, just consider it all joy when you go into trial, as though when trials come you should be ecstatic. And when we looked at the argument last week, it doesn't mean that you should go looking for trials and go, man, I can't wait for the next trial to come along. I'm so excited about suffering because I'm going to have you locked up. But the point about the considering it joyful is the fact that the suffering comes, or the trials come, or the temptations come, not to be your harm, but to be your help. They're designed to strengthen the relationship with Jesus Christ. And we use the analogy of a young bird, and that's what the word test means. A young bird sitting on the edge of the nest trying to test its wings. And in so doing, when it takes flight, it has shown perseverance, it has shown endurance, and then it continues on into maturity. And then the author, James, makes this shift asking about wisdom. And a lot of times people read and say, well, James is transition, because James will do this. James will be going along and then, oh, red car, and then come back. And it's almost like James had ADD, but he didn't. I mean, he's not writing necessarily as Paul does. Paul has a unified theme. When he begins writing a book, he has a unified theme, and he carries it all the way through. James kind of popcorns around. And he comes back to topics, and then he kind of goes off over here, and then he kind of like me when I'm preaching, and then a rabbit chops up, and then, oh, look, a red car, and then we come back. And so a lot of people think that's what James is doing here, because he's starting to talk about wisdom and being driven by the surf. But what happens is these two actually are congruent with each other. Why? Because as we go through trial, it's simply not enough to go through trial and not learn anything. See, because if we don't learn from the trials, it's like the kid that touches the hot pot more than once. It only took me one time to look at a hot pot. Ow! Well, okay, twice. But there's a point in the asking of the wisdom. It's not a secondary argument or second argument. The point of the asking about the wisdom is as you're going through the trial, we ask for wisdom and we ask for faith. Why? Because it is essential for the believer not to just simply look for worldly wisdom, but the wisdom of God and the surface and the point of the trial. Notice what he says here. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives it generously, without reproach, and it'll be given to him. Now, that's an interesting statement. We said we thought so too. By the way, that's like a time filler statement for pastors when they say that, because they're like stalling for time. No, I'm kidding. It's interesting because he says, hey, look, I give it to you freely, but there's a caveat for this wisdom. Now, it's not simply enough that as we go through trials, and then as we learn from our trials, that we simply stop there. See, the life about the believer is through this trial and the wisdom, is in the process of being made complete. The argument is part of being made complete, to be made mature, to be made perfect. And one of the ways to do that is as we go through these trials and come back around, we ask God for the wisdom to be able to face them. Why? Because then we have the faith like that of the Old Testament heroes of the faith. Daniel knew that he could pray with his windows open, even though he knew that he would be under death sentence if he was caught. Because he understood the wisdom that the God in which he served had been with him all the way through to this point. Job could make the statement, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I have committed no sin in his eyes, even though his three friends have said, Job, you must have really screwed up. See, the wisdom that you're asking God for is not something to make, as a lot of people like to say, well, it's like an earthly wisdom or make you more smart. No, it's to understand the reason why God lets you go through these things and the end result of what occurs out of that, which is to make one a mature believer and a mature. If that is a word, I like to make up my own words. So if you're an English, I'm going to butcher it. And so as you become more and more mature in your faith, that's part of the whole asking of the wisdom part of this analogy or this sermon. Why? Because it's there that we begin to see beyond the, oh, God's just making this all hard for me. Well, there's only two certainties in life, death and taxes, and troubles come along with it. See, that's the resignation that comes without wisdom. That's the resignation that comes without understanding the wisdom of God has as we go through this. Why? Because, again, the suffering and the trials are not for our detriment. They are for our betterment. And see, when we begin to look at it and see through God's eyes as to why we suffer and for the purpose of that suffering, we begin to see with a wisdom that is not a worldly and earthly wisdom. So we try to spin this into earthly wisdom. Well, just if you're dumb, ask God for more wisdom. He'll help you on your test. No, wrong use of this verse. It's talking about in the trials to where you can look with the assurity and know that God is there with you. And as you go through, He is going to be there with you. Why? Because then the rest of this doesn't make any sense. Why? Let's take a look at this. Let's see what the rest of this is. Let him ask in faith without doubting. For one who doubts is like surf of the sea driven and tossed by wind. When you ask for wisdom, you got to ask without doubting. Now, what would that look like? Have you ever seen somebody cross ice? I was exiled to Michigan for 5 years as a kid with my family. My dad worked in sales. And I was born in West Virginia, and then we moved to Mississippi where they said I talked funny. I said, y'all talk funny. And then I went to Michigan, and they said, you talk funny. And there they had pens and pins where I've always had a pen. And they thought I talked funny, which is weird because they talk funny. Anyhow, if you've ever seen somebody cross a little bit of water on ice, they kind of do this. Because if it breaks under this foot, you see, the rest of you, the mindset is, won't fall in. And that's what we do when we ask God for faith. See, when we ask God for faith, we go, God, give me some wisdom through faith, because I want to step out and trust you on this big decision. I'm asking faithfully that you help me in this really big decision. That part cracked. And we do that. And so what happens is we're not really asking in faith. I've had people say, I know that God can provide, but what happens if He doesn't? Carry the one. I know God can provide. I know that God can provide. But because what is the premise of that understanding? The premise of that understanding is, yes, while God can provide, He's not really going to do it. Yeah. I mean, technically God can do all things, but in this situation, let's cover our bases. Let's make sure that our bases are covered. That way, in case God bails, we've got an alternative plan. Here's the thing about God's wisdom and faith. It requires being totally sold out. There's no testing ice. There's no backup plan. When God says, hey, this is where I want you to go. Notice when in the Old Testament, when He says, Abram, I want you to go to a land which I'll show you. Abram doesn't move 10 miles down the road and go, here?
Don't wait for him. I want you to move to the left.
Okay. Here?
A little bit further down the road, neighbor.
Well, I don't know those people.
You'll be all right.
We do this in our thinking. And we do this and unconsciously because we have people in our life that say they're going to help us and do things for us and be there with us. We all know the person that says, oh yeah, man, I'll be like Peter. Peter's a great example. Lord, even though all these other 11 chumps are going to leave you, I will go with you to the end. I don't know this man. I've never met that man. I went to the store to get a paper and I ran into this dude. I don't know this person. Right? We look at this in faith concept like Lucy holding the football. Lucy being God holding the football. And we're Charlie Brown. You know the analogy? Charlie Brown and Lucy kicking the football? Is this going over? Or is it hitting like lead and sand? Well, Google search it. And what's Google? Type in Google on your computer and Charlie Brown and Lucy, and he goes running at the football, goes to kick, and she goes, whoop! And he misses. See, a lot of times when we ask God for things, and ask God for wisdom, and ask God in faith for things, we ask with the expectation of it not happening. And that's doubt. God, and you see people do this all the time. Well, God can do all things. I'm really praying that God will help, but folks, that's like people being driven by the wind on the ocean. It's like a boat being rudderless. That's the whole purpose of some of what's going on in Hebrews is the fact that they are drifting like a boat without a rudder. And y'all thought Tim's mess up this morning was going to carry the day. There you go, Tim. They'll forget about you on that one now. A rudderless boat drifting along because it's lost its moorings. Because our understanding of faith is God can, but isn't gonna always. And when we have thinking like that, folks, that's called doubt. That's not faith. There's no faith in that. Here's the interesting thing about faith and wisdom and God's economy. When we begin to ask God for things that we ourselves can actually do. God, I ask that you allow me the ability to walk to that pulpit. It's a miracle. God can enable me the faith to walk to the pulpit. Now, if I was in a wheelchair and walked that far, okay, I'll give you that. But if it's something that you can accomplish within your own strength, there's nothing really miraculous about it. There hasn't nothing really faithful about it. And here's the thing. Miracles really require the impossible task. The faith that he is talking about here and the faith that sees you through the trials is through the impossibility of the trial. Because when it's really, really dark in the midst of the trial, sometimes it's hard to see where the end result is going to go. And you have to have the faith that God is going to see it through. Just like in our everyday walk with life, if what we want is something that we can obtain, we can do it in our own strength, us asking God for help and then doing it without expecting Him to follow through is not faith. In our own walk here at Skyline Baptist, if we are sitting here and we're thinking all we want to do is restore back to where we were, folks, we can do that. That's accomplishable. That's a reachable goal. But expecting great things from God and not demanding things, but expecting great things from God and expecting God to do great things through us, that requires faith. And that requires us to have a planning goal that is far greater than what we can attain just by the folks that are sitting here tonight or on Sunday morning. Why? Because that's asking God for things and then expecting God to do those things. That's the faith that God is requiring us to have here in this test. Why? Because as we look ahead, if we can do it, then it's in our own strength. But if we're sitting there going along like this, every time God asks us to step out and testing the waters, instead of just standing and going, it's not faith, it's doubt. I'll give you a good example. When y'all called me to come to be your pastor, I was talking to some friends. They said, well, because I told them I was thinking about buying a house. They said, well, I'd rethink that decision. I said, why? And they said, well, you don't know those people. They may not like you. I said, well, that's true. I'm a pretty cocky and arrogant kind of guy. They may not like me. That was a joke. But apparently I'm a pretty arrogant guy. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. My wife on our first date, I like that pause. She told me, she goes, I thought you were pretty, what was it, cocky and arrogant? Is that what you said? Abrasive. And I said, how'd you figure that out on just the first date? I'll pay for that one later. But they are like going, hey, look, you don't know these folks. They may like you, but they may not. And, you never know how things are going to turn out within a year or two. Why don't you rent a house first and find out? And then I said, well, wait a second. Did God call me to this church? Well, yes, I believe God called you to church. But maybe you should. I said, well, wait, stop. Stop right there. Did God call me to come to this church? Yes. Did God call me to be in this community? Yes. Well, then why wouldn't I buy a house in the community because this is where God's calling me? Well, you don't know where God's plan will lead you within the next 5 months. So if I rent or buy, what difference does it make? See, the indication or the implication was, well, you may end up getting fired, and then you may end up being stuck with a house payment. But if this is where God called me one way or the other, it doesn't matter whether I rent or buy. Why? Because God called me here, and therefore I need to be focused on my efforts here. And therefore, if I buy or rent, it doesn't really matter, and I chose to buy. Why? Because I believe God called me to be here and be here for a while. But see, that goes back to that contingency planning. See, when we step out on faith, there is no such thing as a contingency plan. And that really, for guys that are planners, and I'm a planner guy, for a planner guy to not have a backup B plan is nerve-wracking. You can ask my wife, when we go somewhere, she doesn't pack the vehicles not because she doesn't want to. She doesn't pack the vehicles because I look at the vehicle and I'm seeing where everything goes. Bam. And this vehicle is going to have this, and then this one's going to have. And if you saw the hillbilly bandwagon that came into town with us in it, you could see that that's kind of how it looked like going down the side. And so I enjoy a really good plan. A plan is great. Plans are wonderful things until God tells you to step out on faith and follow my plan, and all you know about the plan is just take another step. For me, I want to have that secondary plan, just in case he going, hey, look. But the implication about that is that God somehow enjoys watching us suffer. And the implication about that is that God somehow enjoys yanking the rug out from underneath us when we desperately need it. And none of those implications are about the holy God who desires the great things for his people, and who desires them to believe in him every step of the way, and who desires for them to expect great things from their God and do great things in the name of their God. See, when we begin to step out on faith like that, we can be listed like the folks in the Old Testament, who though they had great moments of doubt, go read Hebrews chapter 11. All those guys, with the exception of 2, were scoundrels. Abraham was a liar. David was a murderer and an adulterer. Gideon was a coward. Samson was a drunkard and defiled the things of God. But yet, when they stepped out in the faith of God to do the things that God asked them to do, they stepped out full-heartedly. Just like you and I. With all of our weaknesses and all of our frailties, and yet when God called them to step out, they stepped out and did great things in the name of God for the sake of God. Christianity demands that we are sold out totally in that vein. And that's scary. Folks, I'll tell you, that's terrifying. Many of you have been in that terrifying experience. I know I've been in that terrifying experience. And you sit there and you look and you go, I hope you know what you're doing, because I don't. You got that? Why? Because it's a scary moment. And that's when we ask for the wisdom to understand that while we may not really see the full grand picture of why this trial and testing is here, we have the understanding of the God who was with us when we tested our wings for our first flight, who was with us in the last test and trial, who was with us during the last moment, and we have perseverance and are learning endurance. And then we can sit and we can go, I don't physically have this, but I serve a God who's there and He has it. That's why Job can say what he says in the midst of the suffering and pain. I know my Redeemer lives. Job, do you hold to your integrity for nothing? Curse God and die. And he doesn't. He refuses. Why? Because he knows his God, and he knows that there's a purpose for what is going on, though he doesn't see it. Let's take a look. Let's see what else we got going on here. For let not a man expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded, man unstable in all his ways. That's the thing. We go, God, I want faith. God, I want wisdom. God, I want to know how to live a life sold out for you. And then when things come along that help push us in that direction, instead of looking at it and saying, oh, well, this is an opportunity for me to grow in that area that I asked for, we look and we go, why? Right? It's kind of like when we ask for patience, which is a dangerous thing to do. Right? Well, Lord, teach me patience. Please don't pray. Please don't pray that for me. Because I usually get stuck in traffic. And that's not a good time for anybody. We ask for these moments. We get put in these positions. And then we don't expect God to see it through. And why would we then expect that God would give to us when we don't believe that God is able to do what we believe God to do? Right? I know that God can do all things. But what's our backup plan? Well, here's the thing. If that whole last statement presupposes that God's not going to do what He's going to do, so why would you ask God to do anything if you're going to doubt the fact that He's going to do anything? Did that make sense? Because in my head it sounded great. Right? It's kind of like when you have that kid and goes, well, I know you're going to do that, but you're not going to do that anyway. We ask God, but we don't ask God believing He'll do it. And then we get mad at God when He doesn't do it. And see, case in point, God didn't help me. But you didn't believe when you asked. You were expecting God not to fulfill. And I'm not talking health and wealth here. A lot of health and wealthers grab this and run with it. I'm not talking health and wealth here. I'm talking daily life of the believer. When we ask God to step in and we ask God for faith, and we ask God for wisdom, and then we go, but deep down, well, I asked for raisins in my oatmeal the other day, and God only gave me oatmeal. I was really hoping for raisins, but you let me down again. This isn't raisins and oatmeal, folks. This is as we go about through our daily walk. We ask God for help in our lives and wisdom and understanding. And we're not trying to put God to test where God validates the fact that He is here to help us. And so we go and say, okay, now God, I want you to jump through this hoop. This isn't like us with Gideon. See, Gideon kind of did that. But here's the thing. Read the rest of the Bible. Gideon's the only one that does that. For us to think that all of us can do that with God is a kind of an arrogant kind of understanding. Oh, God, I'm going to put this fleece out, and if it's wet, just like Gideon, I'll know. No. I've told you to go out. I've told you to go. Step out and go. Why? Because to not believe, then don't expect God to be there to help you. Because you're not asking from the right vein, nor are you expecting God to deliver. You are like sea foam blown across the ocean with no control. You are a rudderless ship. A rudderless ship. Think about a ship without a rudder. it has no means of steering. It gets blown all over the sea because it has nothing to steer it where it needs to go. Folks, faith is that rudder that steers us where we need to go. And when we ask for God to be that steering direction but don't believe that He's going to do it, we've kind of cut the cable to the rudder and say, that's okay, Jesus, take the wheel. And I hate that song, I really do. But that's kind of what we start singing. Folks, listen here. You could be listening to Christian music, praying to God, trying to take a turn at 40 miles an hour doing 100. You're going to leave that road, no matter how much faith you got. Why? It was a bad analogy. But yeah, we'll come back to it. We're like sea foam being blown everywhere. Because, simply this, we don't believe. And we're double-minded. See, the world has a concept of God like a cosmic Santa Claus. Because it doesn't believe in God. And yet the people of God mouth and say, yes, my God can do all things, but He's not going to do it in my life. Why would we expect to get any help with that belief? James tells us, though, that when we go through the trials, let's ask God why. Because God gives it abundantly. So that there isn't a reproach. See, that's the key. Notice how it opens with that, but it closes with a negative. You read the first part, and then you see why you should ask abundantly. Watch that. Did you check that? If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men generously without reproach, and it'll be given to him. Why? Because if you doubt, you're not getting it. But hey, ask for God, ask the right way, and ask believing that God's going to do it. And guess what? He will do it. Have you ever been a part of something like that where you did not believe something there's no way you could see it all work out? You're like, God, I have no clue how you're going to make this work out. I have absolutely no understanding, but I'm going to execute what you've told me to execute. And when it works out, it is going to be amazing. You ever been a part of something like that? If you have, it's an amazing, amazing situation because you look back and go, I would have never done it that way. And I'm glad I'm not in charge. I have. The last 8 months have been a roller coaster ride for me and my family. It's moments where you test your faith and moments where you see God's hand work greatly. And back in February, my world, as I thought it was, came to an absolute, utter halt and crash. My world is over. I'm 43, going back into the workaday world in an economy that's destroyed. Who's going to hire this guy? Sorry. Maybe I shouldn't have phrased it that way. But I said, hey, God, you're going to have to work this out. And I'm going to trust that you're going to work this out. Because I don't see how any of this is going to work out at all. Period. There's no way this is going to work out from an earthly mindset. And yet God required that I stepped out on faith. Why? Because the job that I'd worked for 9 years ended. I had nothing left. And I sat and I watched as God slowly put pieces into place that I had absolutely no control over. And when you're a planner, you are a little bit of a control freak. So you like to have the help in putting, no, not that piece goes there, Lord. That piece would work better over here.
Shut up.
No, really, over here. I got it. I got it. I got it. So I got to watch as God put things together in a right way without me being able to do any of it. And I saw that as I went through it, how I look back on all of it and go, wow, I could not have planned this any better. Actually, if I had planned it, I'd have been somewhere totally elsewhere and not been near as happy as I am today. Because I would have screwed it up. But God told me to step out on faith and take a step incrementally. I had no job, I had no concept, I had nothing. And as the things began to fall into place, I began to see the hand of God move as I said, Lord, I don't see how you're going to make this work. But I'm going to trust that come August 1, that I'm going to have a job and I'm going to be provided for and my family is going to be taken care of. And in all these things that I am worried about on the inside, you're going to iron out and that worry will go away. And guess what, folks? This is October and all that worry, when I look back at it, is inconsequential. It is absolutely nothingness. Because I watched as God put it all together, piece by piece. And made it work out. And my faith was strengthened. I grew and matured more. Because I quit trying to do things for God. And I asked for wisdom, believing that He would see it through. See, doing one thing, say, God, I don't know how you're going to make this work out. And I'm going to turn this over to you. But just in case you don't, I'm going to start calling other folks and making sure that I got a job at Lowe's. Didn't do that. I sent out resumes all over, but I prayed about everyone I went to. Could have sent out resumes to thousands of churches. I sent out resumes only to a handful of places, and I said, Lord, whichever one you pick, where you send me, that's where I'll go. And guess what? That's where we are today. And folks, I'll be honest, you can ask my wife, I sleep better at night because I work with you folks. I'm happier during the day because I work with you folks. The Army was a horrible job for me. Wrong personality with the wrong career. But I had to step out in faith on that and trust God that He would direct my path on that. And it had been so easy during those 6 months while I was waiting to find out where it was to do this the whole time. But that's not faith. That's doubt. We talked about how much fear you had of God this morning. Whether or not you have a low view or a high fear of God. Kind of put the question to us tonight. How much faith do we put in God? How big is the God we serve? Is He big enough to where when life throws you curveballs like loss of job, loss of health, loss of this, loss of... Is He big enough to where you can throw that over onto His shoulder and say, I don't know how you're going to work this out, but I have faith that you are going to work it out. And trust and watch as He does it. Or you're going to come along and say, I know you say you're going to help me, but let me help you on this part. Let me fix this. That's what Abram does. Go read the story of Abram. Abram had 3 deep for the lineage. He was thinking about Eliezer, and God said, it's not going to be through Eliezer. He says, well, I got a maidservant named Hagar. And so he helps God out. And now he causes a separate rivalry to happen when he tries to help God out. And if he just simply had followed what God had told him to do, his world would have changed much drastically. Much drastically. Public school. How big is the God you serve? Is He so big that you can throw those over onto His shoulders and let Him carry you? Or is He only this big and you got to help Him out? Is He so big that you can toss it there and say, I have no clue how you're going to make this work? Or is He kind of iffy and you got to kind of test the waters to make sure He's where you want to be? Folks, how big is He for Skyline? When we think about how big this church is going to be, are we planning 10, 15, 20 years down the road and planning big? Or are we planning to hit what we used to just have? How big is God to you? And how powerful is He in your life? Let's pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank You for this day and for these folks that are here this evening and the fact that You are a big God. And we have seen Your work in our lives. We have seen Your work in the testimony of Your word. We have seen Your work in the accounts in others' lives. And while it's so easy for us to look at the storm and look at the waves and look at all the trials around us and doubt whether or not You are there with us, it is in true maturity and faith in our walk that we look at You and cast our cares upon Him, upon You, because You care for us. And we turn over the fear and doubt and walk in the assurity that the road You called us down, though dark and windy and twisty, is the road You pat us on. And for us to focus there. And not on the waves and not on the storm, but on the fact that You walk with us down this path. And that our walk is secure. Because You are a faithful God to us. We ask You to be with each and every one of us here. We ask these things in Your name we pray. Amen.
Please stand. Hymn number 307, Just As I Am. Just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Just as I am, and waiting not to rid my soul of one dark blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot, O Lamb of God, I come, I come.
Have you hear this? Whoa, there we go. Hear this. Why don't we circle up for our moment of prayer as we go to leave?
I guess I'll be here today.
Hmm?
So I guess I'll be here today.